It was a sultry afternoon, the kind where the air clung to the skin, heavy with heat and unspoken tensions. Mark sat in his spacious living room, his tie loosened and his shirt slightly unbuttoned, staring blankly at the television. The hum of the air conditioner did little to alleviate the oppressive weight of the day. He had been working from home more often lately, a decision born of convenience but one that had inadvertently brought complications. Elena, the maid, moved gracefully through the room, dusting the shelves with precision. Her presence was understated but undeniable. She had worked for Mark and his wife Rachel, for over a year, a quiet and diligent part of their household. Elena was in her late 20s, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets and a natural beauty that didn't go unnoticed. Rachel had left for a weekend retreat with her friends, a much-needed escape, as she had put it, from the monotony of everyday life. Mark had insisted she go, though he had to admit he felt a pang of relief at having the house to himself, or almost to himself. The tension between him and Rachel had been building for months, their conversations growing shorter, their intimacy practically non-existent. "Mr. Carter," Elena's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and melodic. "Would you like me to make you some coffee?" Mark looked at her, his eyes lingering a moment too long. "No, thank you, Elena. But, actually, could you help me with something?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression curious but composed. "Of course. What do you need?" Mark hesitated. "My back has been killing me lately. I think it's from sitting at the computer all day. Do you know anything about massages?" Elena's cheeks flushed slightly, but she nodded. "A little. My grandmother taught me when I was younger. It's good for relieving tension." "Would you mind?" he asked, his tone bordering on sheepish. "Just for a few minutes? I'd really appreciate it." She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway as if to confirm they were alone. "All right," she said finally. "Let me get some oil." Mark's heart quickened as he watched her leave the room, her figure disappearing into the kitchen. He shifted uncomfortably, aware of the impropriety of his request but unable to stop himself. When Elena returned, she carried a small bottle of lavender-scented oil. "You can sit here," she said, gesturing to the edge of the couch. Mark complied, leaning forward as she poured a small amount of oil into her hands, warming it between her palms. Her touch was tentative at first, her fingers gliding over his shoulders and neck. But as she grew more confident, her movements became firm and deliberate, kneading the knots that had settled in his muscles. "You're very tense," she murmured, her voice close to his ear. Mark let out a low sigh, the tension in his body beginning to melt under her skilled hands. "That feels amazing," he admitted. "I had no idea you were this good at it." "Thank you," she said softly. "It's important to take care of yourself." Her hands moved lower, working along his upper back. The intimate nature of the moment was not lost on either of them. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. Mark's breath hitched as her fingers brushed against the edge of his shirt, her touch lingering a second longer than necessary. "Elena," he said, his voice husky. "You really have a gift." She paused, her hands stilling for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." "Call me Mark," he said, turning slightly to look at her. Their eyes met, the distance between them suddenly feeling insurmountable and non-existent all at once. Elena stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should finish cleaning," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Mark stood, reaching out to touch her arm. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elena, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's all right, Mr. Carter. But maybe it's better if we keep things professional." Mark nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're right. Thank you for the massage. It really did help." Elena offered him a small smile before turning and leaving the room. Mark sank back onto the couch, the lingering scent of lavender a reminder of the line he had nearly crossed. The house was silent once more, but the echoes of that moment lingered, a testament to the fragility of boundaries and the complexities of human connection. The afternoon stretched on, and Mark found himself unable to focus. The massage had left more than a physical impact, it awakened thoughts and emotions he had no business entertaining. As Elena moved about the house, her presence became magnetic, her every gesture imbued with an allure that Mark couldn't ignore. He tried to immerse himself in work, but the memory of her hands, the scent of lavender, and the soft tone of her voice distracted him. That evening, Mark's attempt to busy himself with emails and spreadsheets faltered. When Elena entered the room to inform him she'd finished for the day, he stopped her. Elena, he began, hesitating as if searching for the right words. Thank you again for earlier. I didn't realize how much I needed that. She offered a small smile, her eyes briefly meeting his. I'm glad it helped, Mr. Carter. If there's nothing else, I'll head home for the night. But there was something else, though Mark couldn't articulate it. He nodded instead, watching her leave. The silence she left behind was deafening. That night, his sleep was restless, his dreams a tangled blur of images he struggled to suppress upon waking. The next morning, Mark woke with a sense of unease. Rachel's absence, once a relief, now felt like a void he couldn't ignore. He avoided his reflection in the mirror, unable to face the guilt simmering just beneath the surface. Elena arrived as usual, greeting him with her customary politeness. Mark noticed her subtle changes, a new hairstyle, a faint trace of perfume, and wondered if he'd simply failed to see these things before. Their conversations grew slightly longer, though they danced around anything personal. She spoke of her family back home, of the life she'd left behind to pursue opportunities here. Mark found himself drawn to her stories, her voice, and the way she lit up when describing her younger siblings. By mid-afternoon, the heat of the day became oppressive again. Mark found himself in the living room, nursing a coffee and scrolling aimlessly through his phone. Elena entered, carrying a tray of freshly laundered clothes. You don't have to stay in this heat, Mark said, glancing up at her. Take a break. She hesitated. I still have the upstairs to clean. That can wait, Mark insisted, gesturing toward the couch. Sit down for a bit. She hesitated again, then set the tray down and sat at the edge of the couch, her posture straight and formal. Mark chuckled softly. You don't have to be so stiff, Elena. This is your home too, in a way. Elena's lips twitched into a faint smile. It doesn't feel that way sometimes. Mark leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? She glanced at him, her dark eyes searching his. It's hard to explain. I'm here so much, but it's not my space. I belong but I don't. Her words struck a chord. Mark felt the weight of her statement, understanding on some level the loneliness it implied. I can't imagine it's easy, he said softly. You've done so much for us, and I don't think we've ever really shown how much we appreciate it. Elena shook her head. You don't have to say that. I mean it, Mark said firmly. The room grew quiet, the space between them thick with unspoken thoughts. He found himself wanting to close that space, to reassure her in a way that went beyond words. Instead, he leaned back, breaking the moment. I should let you get back to work. Elena stood, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Mr. Carter. He nodded, watching her retreat once again. Mark couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. There was a vulnerability in Elena's words that resonated with him. It wasn't just her beauty that captivated him, it was her quiet strength, her determination, and the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world without complaint. As the day stretched on, Mark found himself drawn to her presence. He noticed the way her hair glinted in the sunlight streaming through the windows, the way her lips curved when she thought no one was watching. It was wrong, he knew. Rachel was his wife, his partner, the person he had promised to love and cherish. But their relationship had become a shadow of what it once was, and in the absence of that connection, Elena's light was impossible to ignore. Late in the afternoon, Mark decided to step outside. The backyard was quiet, the garden lush and vibrant thanks to Elena's care. She had a talent for nurturing things, he realized. Plants thrived under her touch, just as his tension had melted away beneath her hands the day before. Elena, he called out when he saw her kneeling near the rose bushes, her hands deftly pruning the stems. She looked up, startled, then quickly stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. Mr. Carter, do you need something? Please, he said, holding up a hand. Call me Mark. And no, I don't need anything. I just wanted to thank you again for everything you do around here. This garden looks incredible. She smiled shyly, her gaze dropping to the ground. It's nothing. I enjoy taking care of it. It's not nothing, he insisted. You've turned it into something beautiful. Rachel always says how much she loves it. Elena's smile faltered slightly at the mention of Rachel's name, but she quickly recovered. That means a lot. Thank you. Mark hesitated, then gestured toward the patio chairs. Why don't you sit for a minute? Take a break. It's too hot to be working so hard. I'm fine, she said, though her flushed cheeks suggested otherwise. Please, Mark said, his tone gentle but firm. I insist. Reluctantly, Elena took a seat, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to spring up at any moment. Mark sat across from her, his gaze steady. You don't have to be so formal, you know, he said with a chuckle. I'm not going to bite. Elena laughed softly, a sound that sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the sun. I'm just not used to this. Most of the families I've worked for, they don't talk to me like this. Well, they're missing out, Mark said before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning he wasn't sure he intended. Elena looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Mark, she began, her voice hesitant. Yes. She shook her head, as if deciding against whatever she was about to say. Nothing. I should get back to work. Mark stood as she did, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch her arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through both of them. Elena, he said softly, his voice almost pleading. You don't always have to be working. You deserve to rest too. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The tension between them was palpable, a magnetic pull that neither of them could deny. But just as quickly as the moment came, Elena stepped back, breaking the connection. I appreciate that, she said, her tone careful. But I really should finish the garden before the sun sets. Mark watched her walk away, a mixture of regret and longing twisting in his chest. He knew he was treading dangerous waters, but the line between right and wrong had never felt so blurred. Later that evening, Mark found himself unable to concentrate on anything. The house felt too quiet, too empty. He poured himself a glass of wine, hoping it would calm his restless mind, but it only seemed to heighten his awareness of the silence. Elena was still in the house, finishing up her work for the day. He could hear the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen, the sound grounding him in a way he couldn't explain. Without thinking, he found himself walking toward the kitchen. Elena was at the sink, her back to him as she washed the last of the day's dishes. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. Elena, he said, his voice startling her. She turned, her hands still wet, a surprised look on her face. Mr. Carter. Mark. Is something wrong? No, he said quickly, shaking his head. I just wanted to say good night. She smiled, her expression softening. Good night, Mark. I'll see you tomorrow. He nodded, lingering for a moment longer than he should have. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. That night, Mark lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a tangled mess, a cacophony of guilt, desire, and confusion. He knew he couldn't continue like this, but he also couldn't bring himself to confront the feelings that had taken root. As he finally drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in his mind. Elena was more than just a maid. She was a presence that had awakened something in him he thought had long been dormant. And he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight it, or give in. The morning sunlight streamed through the large bay windows, casting warm golden light across the living room. Mark sat at the dining table, nursing a cup of coffee, his mind swirling with unresolved thoughts. Sleep had been elusive, stolen by the persistent image of Elena's delicate smile, her soft voice echoing in his ears. Elena entered the room quietly, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. She moved with the same graceful efficiency as always, her presence a calming force amidst the turmoil in Mark's mind. Good morning, he said, his voice breaking the silence. Elena glanced up, her cheeks flushing faintly. Good morning, Mark. He gestured toward the seat across from him. Have you had breakfast yet? There's plenty of coffee if you want some. Elena hesitated, the basket in her arms serving as a shield. I usually eat after finishing my work. Mark gave her an encouraging smile. Take a break. You work too hard. She hesitated for a moment longer, then placed the basket on the counter and joined him at the table. Mark poured her a cup of coffee, sliding it across to her. Thank you, she said softly, cradling the mug between her hands. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the tension between them subdued but not absent. Mark found himself stealing glances at her, the way her fingers traced the rim of the cup, the way her lashes brushed against her cheeks when she looked down. Elena, he began, his voice cautious. She looked up, her expression open yet guarded. Yes. Have you ever thought about doing something else? You're clearly talented and hardworking. You could do anything you set your mind to. Her lips curved into a small bittersweet smile. I've thought about it, yes. But life doesn't always give you the luxury of choice. Mark nodded, her words resonating deeply. That's true. But you deserve more, Elena. More than this. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the mug. It's kind of you to say that, but I've made my peace with where I am. Mark reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through both of them. Elena's eyes widened slightly, her gaze locking with his. Elena, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She pulled her hand away, breaking the connection. I should get back to work, she said quickly, standing up and reaching for the laundry basket. Mark rose as well, a sense of urgency driving him. Wait, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Please. Just stay for a moment. Elena froze, her back to him. Slowly, she turned, her expression conflicted. Mark, this isn't, we can't. I know, he said, his tone filled with quiet desperation. I know it's complicated, but I can't ignore what I feel. Her eyes filled with tears, her composure slipping. You're married, she said, her voice trembling. You have a wife who loves you. Mark looked down, shame and regret twisting in his chest. I know, he said softly. And I hate myself for feeling this way. But, Elena, I can't stop thinking about you. You've brought something back into my life that I thought was gone forever. Elena shook her head, stepping back. This isn't fair. To me, to you, to your wife. You have to stop, Mark. Please. Her words were like a knife to his heart, but he knew she was right. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't mean to put you in this position. Elena nodded, her expression pained. I care about this job. I care about you. But this can't happen. I need to keep my boundaries, for both our sakes. Mark watched her leave the room, the weight of her words sinking in. He had crossed a line, and now he had to live with the consequences. As the day wore on, Mark tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Elena. He knew he had to find a way to restore their professional relationship, to rebuild the trust he had shaken. That evening, he approached her as she was finishing up in the kitchen. Elena, he said, his voice tentative. She turned, her expression wary. Yes, Mark. I just wanted to apologize, he said, his tone sincere. I crossed a line, and I regret it. You're right, we need to keep things professional. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. Her expression softened slightly, and she nodded. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I mean it, he said. I value everything you do here, and I don't want to jeopardize that. Elena offered him a small smile, the tension between them easing slightly. Thank you. I think we can move past this. Mark felt a flicker of relief, but he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The feelings he had for Elena weren't something he could simply turn off, but he was determined to respect her boundaries. The following week, Mark made a conscious effort to keep his interactions with Elena strictly professional. He focused on his work, avoided lingering in the same room as her, and kept their conversations brief and polite. Elena seemed to appreciate his efforts, and the tension between them gradually began to fade. But no matter how hard he tried, Mark couldn't shake the lingering feelings that had taken root in his heart. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, he found himself thinking about Rachel. She would be returning from her trip the next day, and he felt a pang of guilt for how he had spent the past week. He knew he needed to address the issues in their marriage, to find a way to rekindle the connection they had lost. But the thought of doing so felt overwhelming, especially now that his feelings for Elena had complicated everything. As he stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace, Mark made a silent vow to himself. He would fight to save his marriage, to rediscover the love he had once felt for Rachel. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. And deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. Rachel's return home was marked by an air of routine cheerfulness. She breezed into the house with her overnight bag slung over her shoulder, her voice bright as she called out, "Mark? I'm home." Mark emerged from his study, his face a carefully composed mask of warmth. "Welcome back," he said, meeting her with a brief embrace. Rachel studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "How was your weekend? You didn't look too bored without me, I hope." Mark forced a chuckle. "It was fine. Quiet, mostly." She nodded, her attention already shifting. "Good. I'm glad I took this trip though. It was just what I needed." As Rachel unpacked and began recounting her adventures with friends, Mark found himself half listening, his thoughts straying to Elena. The sense of guilt gnawed at him, sharper now with Rachel's presence. He resolved to focus on his marriage, to make amends for his emotional indiscretions. The following days were a blur of effort. Mark made it a point to engage with Rachel more, asking about her day, planning dinners, and even suggesting a weekend getaway. Rachel responded warmly, seemingly unaware of the turmoil beneath the surface. But despite his best efforts, the spark that had once defined their relationship remained elusive. Their conversations lacked depth, their laughter felt strained, and their intimacy was a shadow of what it had been. One evening, as Mark worked late in his study, a soft knock on the door drew his attention. "Come in," he said, expecting Rachel. To his surprise, it was Elena. She stepped inside hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. "I wanted to let you know I'll be leaving early tomorrow," she said. "I have a family matter to attend to." Mark nodded, setting down his pen. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it's nothing serious. Just something I need to take care of." Mark studied her for a moment, his concern genuine. "If there's anything you need, help, time off, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Mark." He looked up, his chest tightening at the sound of his name on her lips. "Yes." She seemed to struggle with her words, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I want you to know. I appreciate how you've respected my boundaries. It means a lot." Mark felt a pang of emotion, her words both a comfort and a reminder of the unspoken tension between them. "You deserve that and more, Elena. You're an incredible person." She gave him a small, wistful smile before slipping out of the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The next morning, as Elena prepared to leave, Rachel called out to her from the kitchen. "Elena, before you go, could you help me with the guest room sheets? They're such a hassle to manage on my own." Elena hesitated but nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Carter." Mark watched from the hallway, an odd sense of unease settling over him. Rachel had always been polite to Elena, but there was a newfound warmth in her tone that felt out of place. As the day wore on, Mark found himself replaying the morning's interactions in his mind. He wondered if Rachel suspected something, if her demeanor toward Elena was a subtle interrogation masked as friendliness. When Elena returned the next day, she seemed quieter than usual. Mark noticed her subdued energy but refrained from prying, respecting her privacy. But as the days passed, the tension between them began to creep back in. Their stolen glances grew longer, their exchanges more charged. Despite their best efforts to maintain professionalism, the undercurrent of unspoken emotions was impossible to ignore. One evening, Mark came home late from a business meeting to find the house dark except for a faint glow from the kitchen. Curious, he stepped inside to see Elena sitting at the table, her hands cradling a cup of tea. "Elena," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping at her cheeks. "I didn't mean to bother you." Mark sat down across from her, his concern outweighing his caution. "You're not bothering me. What's wrong?" She hesitated, then sighed. "It's my family. My brother. He's been struggling, and I'm trying to help him, but it's hard." Mark reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. "I'm sorry, Elena. I wish there was something I could do." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper. "You've already done so much, Mark. More than you realize." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, the silence between them heavy with possibility. But before either of them could speak, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. Elena pulled her hand back quickly, rising from the table. "I should go," she said, her voice hurried. Mark nodded, his chest tight as he watched her leave. The following weeks brought a fragile equilibrium. Mark focused on his work and his efforts to reconnect with Rachel, while Elena maintained her professional distance. But the lingering tension between them refused to dissipate, a constant reminder of what had nearly happened. One afternoon, as Mark sat in his study, Rachel entered with a thoughtful expression. "Mark," she began, her tone measured. He looked up, bracing himself. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking," she said, sitting down across from him. "About us. Our marriage." Mark's stomach tightened. "What about it?" Rachel hesitated, then sighed. "We've been distant. For a long time now. And I think we need to address it. He nodded, her words echoing his own thoughts. I agree. We've both been so caught up in our own worlds that we've lost sight of each other. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. Do you think we can fix it? Find our way back to what we used to have? Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her question pressing down on him. I don't know, he admitted. But I want to try. I want to fight for us. Rachel reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Then let's try, she said softly. As they sat together, a fragile hope began to take root. But in the back of Mark's mind, the memory of Elena lingered, a reminder of the complexities that still lay ahead.